from the land of Egypt. God established himself as the God of Israel as they were coming out of the land of Egypt. Okay? Here's a couple of thoughts here, and I want to say this. I spent a lot of time meditating on these couple of verses here because there were things that I assumed that maybe you also assumed. And when I actually then stopped and stepped back and looked at it and considered carefully what was going on here, it just helped me to view this very, very differently. His past mercy. He'd established himself as God when they were a nation being formed and being birthed as they came out of the land of Egypt. Now, I know they were a nation as under Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. They were a nation, no doubt. But they weren't a nation in the sense that we know them from the Exodus onward. Okay? And so he's establishing himself as their God from that time. As a nation, Israel had only known God through the oral teaching that had been passed on to them through Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and then their fathers. They didn't have a Bible to go to. They didn't have a Ten Commandments. They didn't have Numbers and Deuteronomy and Leviticus and Exodus. They had none of that. And these were the things that I think myself, I probably knew it in theory, but I hadn't really applied the knowledge into these passages. And so in reality, as they're captives there in the land of Egypt, the only thing they know about God is what's being told to them by the fathers. They would be able to know about some of the past blessings of God and the works of God, but they couldn't open up a book or they couldn't go to a synagogue and hear the scriptures being read. It didn't exist. There were no sacrifices. There were no offerings. The only covenant that they had was what they were told because of, again, what Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had passed on. I want you to look here. This is important in this sense. Keep your finger there and go to Exodus chapter number 10. And again, just in preparation tonight, as I was in my office tonight, this struck me, this passage, something that Moses said to Pharaoh, and I went, oh man, no wonder he said that. And it makes perfect sense in this context now. Exodus chapter 10, verses 24 to 26. And Pharaoh called unto Moses and said, Go ye, serve the Lord, only let your flocks and your herds be stayed. He wants the animals to stay behind. Let your little ones also go with you. And now watch what Moses said. Moses said, Thou must give us also sacrifices and burnt offerings that we may sacrifice unto the Lord our God. Our cattle also shall go with us. There shall not an hoof be left behind. Now watch. For therefore must we take to serve the Lord our God, and we know not with what we must serve the Lord until we come thither. He's saying we got to take everything with us. They knew that animal sacrifices would be part of it'd be orally passed on from Adam on downward, the animal sacrifices. But they had no idea what God was going to ask of them when they got out in the wilderness. They didn't know if he was going to say a turtle dove or an ox or a lamb or a goat they had no idea. A pig? You understand? And so Moses said, no, we're taking them all with us because when we get out there, we don't know what God's asking of us. Well, I think about that when we go back to the book of Hosea here, because he's establishing himself as their God, and they have no experience with him yet, really. They've not heard anything from him except what's been told. Now, for example, the nation itself didn't have this experience, but certainly individuals knew and recognized the hand and the blessing of God on them as a nation. They knew the protection of God. They would be able to see that. And here's why I guess I'm laboring this point a little bit tonight, for this reason. Probably many of us tonight sit here in the same condition as Israel did in the land of the Exodus in Egypt. Is we've heard a lot, and we don't mind accepting it. But we don't actually know his works ourselves. We read books about revival, but we've not seen it ourselves. We read books and we hear stories about people being saved or great things being accomplished. A lot of the missionaries that we've had come and preach our missions conference have told us about wonderful things that God's done in those lands, and it's fantastic, and we accept it as true. But most of us sitting here tonight would say, probably not really ever seen much like that, not really experienced much like that. But we believe it. And we can point to things like, well, I know that God provided for me here, or He protected us there, or He watched over us there. But look at these people, for example. The Hebrew midwives, they feared God enough to ignore Pharaoh's edict about killing all of the young boys. And God blessed them. But they had no scripture to go off of for that. They just feared God. Okay? And so they knew that the protective and blessings of God were on their house because that they feared God. The nation itself increased under the mighty hand of the Egyptians. And the more they persecuted them, the more they grew and the more they prospered. So they had that. But they didn't have Sinai. They didn't have the wilderness wanderings yet. They didn't have shoes that didn't wear out, clothes that didn't wear out, manna on the ground, none of it. And what God is doing is saying, I'm establishing myself as your God. And this is what He's talking about in verse 9 of Hebrews 12, or Hosea 12. I that am the Lord thy God from the land of Egypt. In Egypt, and Israel's going out of Egypt, God established to that generation of people, I'm your God. Man, now I'm telling you, I spent a lot of time thinking about that. And I asked the Lord, would you help us? That you would establish with us, or with our generation, you're our God. Let us know those blessings and those movements and protections and those miracles firsthand. Let us see your hand at work and know the mighty power of God firsthand. I would love for my children to see God work, and there's no question it was God. It wasn't somebody working behind the scenes. There's no manipulation of anything. It was clearly God. And for them to experience that and say, He's my God, because I watched Him do those things. He protected them from the plagues. So there were plagues from which they were protected and not destroyed, but the whole land of Egypt was destroyed around them. There was the protection from the Egyptian army who came after them after they left Egypt, but then was drowned in the Red Sea. There were the promises that God made through the covenant established with them on Mount Sinai. Then there were the provisions that were made during their time in the wilderness, both before and after their refusal to enter Canaan land. And on it went, where God is saying, I'm your God. I'm your God. Love me, know me. So God, was their Lord from the land of Egypt. But then also His future mercy in verse number 9. I am the Lord thy God from the land of Egypt. I that am the Lord thy God from the land of Egypt I will, these are promises, future blessings, will yet make thee to dwell in tabernacles as in the day of the solemn feast. The God who had delivered them in time past from what appeared to be impossible circumstances in Egypt is the same God and the same power that was pronouncing these things to them on that very day through Hosea. He wants them to draw back and remember the God of mercy from the past so that they'll put their confidence in the God of mercy in the future as well. And so because He was the same God who had delivered them from impossible circumstances in Egypt, He could be that God that would deliver them from their impossible circumstances where they are right now, caught up in the bondage of idolatry. And He can deliver them. And this is His mercy. Because who wouldn't vote for God to say, just wipe them out and start over? Just squash them. They've rejected you. Well, as a nation, He said, I'm going to make you dwell in tabernacles. Now, there is no question that this was a reference to the Feast of the Tabernacles found in Leviticus number 23, chapter 23. And if you read verses 34 to 43, you'll find the provisions there for the Feast of Tabernacles along with some other things. But here's the long and the short of it. In the Feast of Tabernacles, they were to dwell in booths, and that dwelling in booths was to remind them of their deliverance from Egypt. Secondly, they were to do no servile work on the first or the 8th day of that feast. Thirdly, the feast itself became associated with the harvest time, or what they called the ingathering, the harvest. So it was a type of God's blessing. They planted, they watered, God gave them increase, and they harvested that. That was the Feast of Tabernacles. And then fourthly, it points to a time of restoration and glory under the rule of the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, he said that it would be as in the days, so it wasn't just the Feast of Tabernacles. And so he's not saying that you're going to celebrate the feast as much as he's saying, I'm going to put you in tabernacles, and the blessings of the Feast of Tabernacles will be on you. That is, you'll be reminded of a deliverance from a time of bondage. You'll have a time of rest where there'll be no servile work any longer. There'll be an association of times when God blesses the land of Israel again, where they have great crops growing up in that land. It points to, again, that time of restoration. And under Jesus Christ, they'll be able to say, we have our Messiah. We have our glory and our blessing seated on the throne of David with us now. And that's what he's saying. I'm going to do this for you, just as I did in the days of the Feast of Tabernacles. And then God's continual mercy found in verse number 10. I have also spoken by the prophets, and I have multiplied visions and used similitudes by the ministry of the prophets. Although the nation persisted in sin, yet God used prophets to draw, to warn, to remind Israel of His presence and His desire for them. He never gave up. He never stopped sending more prophets. We have the written prophets, but what about those? There's reference made to a lot of different prophets that didn't write in the Bible. And those prophets are also speaking on behalf of God, and they're trying to get Israel to come back to God. It says there He spoke. That's the words of the prophets speaking for God. Those are the words of God. He multiplied visions. That was God having shown those prophets many things to come. And He used similitudes. God had used many comparisons to teach and to lead Israel. This is the ministry of the prophets. Throughout the ages, the ministry of the prophets, to reveal to people what God is communicating to His people. Now, just as a note, so that we don't get off track here, those words and visions and similitudes are now found in the Bible. We don't look for a prophet to come and reveal something new to us. We have what we need in the Word of God. It's closed. And anyone who claims to come and be a prophet who's repeating something but that's not found in the Bible is a false prophet. The only true prophet today is those who stand and say what God said. You understand? That's really important. If I stood up today, if I stood up on Sunday and I said, God's given me a vision, a new revelation, I would hope that before I had those words out of my mouth that you'd have me out the door. Really? Because I would be a liar, I'd be a false prophet. The only business I have as a New Testament prophet is telling you, this is what God said. Anything else cannot be tested. You've got to be able to find it in the book. So that's important. All right, and then there's a refusal. So this chapter jumps back and forth, but there's a refusal here, and the refusal is, in light of everything that God's doing, they still refuse to take advantage of the good blessings of God. It's incredible. And so you find there in verse number 11, he asks a rhetorical question here. Is there iniquity in Gilead? It'd be like this. It'd be like a parent goes and says to the kids, look, you clean up this room. If you don't clean up this room, well, there'll be big trouble. We'll leave it at that. There'll be big trouble. and you come in and they didn't do it. You say, I'm warning you. It's your last warning. And you come back in and they didn't do it again. So there's some kids going, and it would be as though you go, what are you doing? What are you thinking? Why are you driving toward judgment? That's what God's doing to Israel. Is there iniquity in Gilead? We kind of say it sarcastically today. Are you kidding me? And that's how he's asking this question. Surely they are vanity. They sacrifice bullocks in Gilgal. Yea, their altars are as heaps in the furrows of the fields. God has an absolute disbelief over sin in verse number 11. Now, Gilgal was on the west side of Jordan. Gilgal was on the east side of Jordan. Gilgal was on the west and Gilead was on the east. Both had been places where God had blessed Jacob. Gilead was the place where Jacob fled from Laban, and God was blessing him there. Gilgal was the place where Israel camped after they crossed the Jordan River, and they landed in the promised land. That was the place they called it Gilgal, the place of the rolling, where they circumcised the males, and again, God's blessing was on them there. Yet now, according to Hosea 6 and verse number 8, Gilead is filled with godlessness. So again, this question isn't one of inquiry, but rather of obvious answer. Gilead is filled with iniquity. The inhabitants of Gilead, he said, are vanity. They're full of emptiness and worthlessness, and they've given themselves over to things that will profit them nothing. Gilgal, according to Hosea 9:15, was a place of idols, of sacrifice to idols, and it said of every evil work. All of this found in Gilgal. Both Gilead and Gilgal had multiplied altars, God said, like heaps that are in furrows of the field. They were found everywhere, and they were a detriment to the very land itself, the promised land of God. There are two types of furrows. There's a furrow that you dig to plant, and there's a furrow that you dig to water. Doesn't matter which furrow we're talking about here, because either way, when you pile things up in the furrows, they've lost their purpose. God said, verse 11, their altars are as heaps in the furrows of the fields. Whether it's unable to take seed to grow, or whether it's unable to take water to help those plants grow, they lost their purpose. In the same way, these altars had been built throughout the land. They were destroying the very God-given land that they were dwelling in, and consequently, it was destroying the people themselves. It's incredible. Then he jumps back, he talks about Jacob again in verse number 12. Jacob fled into the country of Syria, and Israel served for a wife, and for a wife he kept sheep. So we come back to Jacob's past, and there's a contrast here. Oh, I wish we could dwell on all this stuff. I really do. I want you to notice this contrast. Jacob fled. Israel served. You see it in verse 12? Jacob fled. Israel served. Jacob is that name that's used when he's not trusting God. Israel is the name used when he's walking with God. When he's not trusting the Lord, he's fleeing, running. When he is trusting the Lord, he's serving. Same person, two attitudes. Fleeing to stay alive because of the deceptions that he'd taken part in. Failure to trust the Lord, failure to walk with God, and backsliding perhaps. But serving to gain what's loved or be loved. Willing to serve, willing to be done wrong by Laban so he could have that bride that he cared about. And you know what he learned in all that? It was a lesson that Jacob had not learned prior to that time. He learned to serve to gain the blessing. Remember we talked about Jacob before. He strove to get the blessings of God. It's admirable about him, and he's constantly trying to get those blessings of God. But you know what he had failed to learn? And God sent him into Laban's house to learn it. Or let him go to Laban's house to learn it. You don't get the blessings that you're striving for by deception. You get them by serving. When you serve me, God says, I'll bless you, and you'll be a prince with God. When you do it on your own, you'll just be a fleeing coward because of your deceptive ways. When Jacob fled into Syria, he gained wealth, he gained wives, and he gained children. Somebody might say, well, see, that's just different from what you're saying. No, lots of people go into the world and gain. Lots of people go away from God and prosper and prosper and prosper. And isn't that what Ephraim was just saying in just a few verses before? Look at how much I have. Isn't that proof that I'm right with God? Well, Jacob prospered too. But he had to learn to serve for what he gained rather than deceiving to get it. But he is separated from his God. He is not where God wanted him to be. You don't hear much conversation going on between Jacob and the Lord in those years at Laban's house. There's not a whole lot of conversation. But when he came out of Syria, he took his wealth, he took his wives, he took his children with him. But most importantly, he returned to his God. And he went back to the place where he had met God and where he could start walking with God again. God waited for him right where he was. God wasn't going to run down into Syria and drag him out of there. He's going to wait for him to come back to him, just like he does with us many times. You want to depart from me? You want to flee? You want to go about it your own way? I'll be here when you get back. And it was there that he inherited his limp, by the way, because you can't wrestle with God and come away unmaimed. But he inherited the name of God, Israel. There's so much going on in all of that. He goes down a deceiver, he comes back a servant. He goes down getting things his own way, he comes back waiting for God to give him his blessings. And he got it. He got the name of God, Israel. I hope you see that. Now the people of Israel are going to go back to the foreign land of Assyria, losing all that they had gained and learning once again